This history is often neglected. Most people already know about Alexander's invasion in the 4th century BCE, but that invasion is just the introductory chapter to a long and complex history connecting the Greco-Roman world with India. Here's 8 fascinating things you might not know about the relationship between ancient Greeks, Romans, and Indians. Let's jump right in. Number 1. Buddhism among the Greeks. Buddhism spread rapidly starting with the reign of Ashoka Maurya. Buddhist missionaries were sent far and wide to proselytize the faith, including the Greek kingdoms that had sprung up in the wake of Alexander's conquest. This was very effective. Eventually, many Greeks living beyond the Mediterranean converted to Buddhism. In fact, archaeologists have discovered ancient Buddhist texts in India and Afghanistan, written in cursive Greek. They've also found numerous Buddhist stupas with Greek inscriptions. But what spurred this conversion to Buddhism? We know that Ashoka sent a Greek Buddhist monk, a man named Dharmarakshita, to proselytize the Buddhist faith among Greek communities living in what is today known as Gujarat and Sindh. Dharmarakshita alone converted as many as 37,000 Greeks over to Buddhism. Still, it wasn't until a century later, with the conversion of the Indo-Greek king Menander I, that the bulk of Greeks in the subcontinent accepted Buddhism. Menander was no ordinary man. He was an expansionary leader who conquered much of northwest India, and was so successful that the famed writer Strabo once said, "Menander conquered more tribes than Alexander the Great." Though relatively short-lived, Menander's Indo-Greek kingdom, centered in what is today known as Punjab, was wealthy and powerful. One indication of this prosperity is that its coinage has been found in lands as distant as Britain. Simply put, Menander's influence cannot be understated. The Milinda Panha text records his conversations with the Buddhist sage Nagasena. "May the venerable Nagasena accept me as a supporter of the faith, as a true convert from today onwards, as long as my life shall last." Menander's personal conversion is a critical event in Greco-Buddhism. With his patronage, most Indo-Greeks converted to Buddhism. This Greco-Buddhist lineage would continue even after the collapse of Menander's Indo-Greek kingdom. Greek successor states in India, such as the Kushan Empire and the Western Kshatrapas, would remain passionate proponents of both the Buddhist faith and Greek culture for hundreds and hundreds of years. Number 2. Greco-Roman art in India. The rise of the Greeks in South Asia led to the development of unique, syncretic art known as the Gandharan style. The Gandharan school of art blended both Hellenistic and native Indian elements. Greek figures were often portrayed alongside or integrated with Indianized elements. For example, sculptures of the Greek titan Atlas would be placed underneath Buddhist temples, signaling that Atlas was holding up the structure. Similarly, Gandharan craftsmen made carvings at the Sanchi monastery that placed Indianized lotus flowers within traditional Greek patterns. But the Gandharan influence wasn't limited to stone sculpture. Indo-Greek coinage mixed the Greek portraiture style with Indianized elements too. This portraiture style was rapidly adopted by native Indian kings. Under the Indo-Greeks, Buddhist art thrived. It is widely believed that the first iconic representations of the Buddha were created in the Gandharan style. Prior to the development of this style, Buddhists avoided representing the Buddha in their art. They were aniconic. Some historians believe that the development of this more relatable, iconic style helped to popularize Buddhism in India. Greek mythological stories also found new life in India. Hercules, Dionysus, and other legendary Greek personages were given Indian travel stories to indicate that they were culturally and spiritually connected to the subcontinent. Regional differences abound. It's worth noting that while the Indo-Greek kingdoms influenced religion and art in North India, in South India, the tastes of the Roman Empire may have been more influential. In Amaravati, located in what is today known as Andhra Pradesh, the Buddhist stupa details the Hindu goddess Ganga in a way that is immediately reminiscent of the Roman goddess Thetis. Nearby at Nagarjunakonda, a wall carving depicts a battle scene heavily inspired by Trajan's column at the Arch of Constantine in Rome. The area also features a Roman-style amphitheater, the only remaining one of its kind in India. These elements could have been integrated into local forms by Indian craftsmen inspired by the influx of Roman coinage and sculpture, or by Roman craftsmen who lived in South India. Number 3. Roman trade with India. The Mediterranean trade with India existed since early antiquity through both maritime and overland routes into the subcontinent. The volume of this trade increased significantly with the establishment of Roman Egypt and with the discovery, by Roman and Greek merchant sailors, of how to use seasonal monsoon winds to carry ships across the Arabian Sea in a straight course. This made a considerable difference to shipping and navigation. Alongside this development, the establishment of Roman Egypt minimized the cost of trading over the Arabian Sea by eliminating bureaucratic middlemen, brought India and Rome into direct contact, and led to political stability. Evidence of the trade abounds, from historical accounts describing the trade to shipwrecked Roman merchant vessels, to discoveries of Roman coinage and goods in India. According to Strabo, in a given year, as many as 120 ships sailed from the port of Myos Hormos to the coast of India. And that's just one of many ports. The trade was so extensive, in fact, that Pliny the Elder, a Roman statesman, complained that Rome's gold coinage was depleting due to the trade. Over 100 million sestertii left circulation every year in service of the trade for Indian luxury goods. In an era with just a few 100 million people living worldwide, this represents an enormous volume of exchange. Many ports in India received Roman goods, though aside from Karachi and Bharuch, it appears that the bulk of the trade was conducted at ports located in South India. In places like Arikamedu, Kavaripatnam, and Muziris, archaeologists have found hoards of coins, shards of Roman amphorae, and many other indications of trade. It is theorized that the Indo-Roman trade was so substantial that it contributed to the development of Golden Age Tamil kingdoms of the Sangam era. In Tamil Sangam literature, we even find references to Indo-Roman trade. The beautifully built ships of the Yavanas came with gold and returned with pepper, and Muziris resounded with the noise of ships arriving. The trade was sufficiently large to justify sending embassies from India to Rome, and vice versa. We know that a Roman embassy was established at Muziris for the benefit of the trade there. Meanwhile, according to the Roman emperor himself, Augustus Caesar, embassies were often sent to me from the kings of India. What goods were exchanged? The Romans exported clothing, ointments, gems, frankincense, glasswork items, lamps, silver and gold, wine, and slaves, while Indian merchants exported spices, cinnamon, peppers, ivory, gems, pearls, exotic animals, fine cloth, silks, and other textile items. Clearly, the Indo-Roman trade was varied, but many goods traded in India actually originated from China and Southeast Asia. In fact, most Chinese silk purchased by Romans was done in Indian markets. As with any trade, even rarer items would sometimes find their way from end to end, such as sculptural art for wealthy buyers. For example, archaeologists have discovered in the ruins of the Roman city of Pompeii what is referred to as the Pompeii Lakshmi. The Pompeii Lakshmi is an ivory statue of the Hindu goddess produced in Telugu, South India, and shipped off to a buyer in the Roman Empire. Number 4. Roman communities in India. The interactions between Rome and India were not distant transactional events. The historical record indicates that there were communities of Roman citizens living and working in cities throughout the subcontinent. Romans in India primarily worked as merchants and craftsmen. The Periplus Maris Erythrae, a Greek navigational book written in the 1st century CE, lists a series of ports along the Indian coast, including but not limited to Bharuch, Muziris, and Arikamedu. An excavation at Arikamedu, near present-day Pondicherry, has revealed a Roman trading settlement of this period, and elsewhere too the presence of Roman trade goods point to a continuous occupation. Hoards of Roman coins and shards of Roman wine amphora have also been found in Muziris, located near present-day Cochin. Muziris was an important port for Roman trade. In fact, even a temple to Augustus Caesar was built in the city, most likely to service the Roman community that had formed around their imperial embassy. There are indications of a Roman presence in other parts of South India too, both coastal and non-coastal, especially where river trade allowed Roman goods and culture to penetrate further inland. From ancient Tamil literature, we're told that there were many Roman merchants trading in the Kaveri Delta, and that they were a very prosperous community. Number 5. Indian visitors in the Greco-Roman world. We know that ancient Indians lived and traveled in the Greco-Roman world. This Indian presence is well recorded. For example, Indian gravestones have been found in Alexandria dating back to the Ptolemaic period, and graffiti motifs on pottery found at ports in the Red Sea reflect the presence of Indian merchants. All this is indicative of significant and regular communities of Indians in the Greco-Roman world. As far back as the life of Socrates, there were Indians either living in or visiting Athens. For example, the historical record reveals that Socrates was involved in conversations with an Indian who was skeptical of his philosophical approach. Also in Athens, a traveling Hindu ascetic from Gujarat, Zarmanochegas, burned himself alive as a demonstration of his faith. This event caused a sensation in Greek society and was a point of discussion for Greek writers. The legendary Roman orator Dio Chrysostom once claimed that Homer's poetry was popular in India, and that Indians were regular members of his audience. It's possible that interest in Greco-Roman art and philosophy attracted traveling scholars from the subcontinent. So, Indians were a normal sight in the Greco-Roman world. They were not only members of the mercantile and diplomatic class, but also missionaries and elite scholars. The historical record seems to support this notion. For example, some historians believe that Ammonius Saccas, a Roman citizen and leading Neoplatonist in Alexandria, was of Indian ethnic origin and may have hailed from what is today known as Bihar. Worth noting, historians believe that Ammonius's Indian origin may explain both the passion for India and Indian philosophy expressed by his student Plotinus, as well as the philosophical similarities between Vedanta Hinduism and Neoplatonism. In fact, it can be argued that Neoplatonism, the foundation for Christian mysticism in the Western world, was significantly influenced by Hinduism. After Ammonius's death, Plotinus even went on a journey to the east for Indian and Persian knowledge. But the Indian presence was hardly limited to intellectual and commercial pursuits. We know that some Indians were slaves in the Greco-Roman world. Records in Rome and Alexandria indicate that a wide variety of persons, from philosophers to merchants, owned Indian slaves. Number 6. Greco-Roman women as slaves in India. Greek slave women first appear in Indian texts in the 5th century BCE. In antiquity, there was an extensive slave trade between the Mediterranean and the subcontinent, driven by the demand for light-skinned Greek women and Indian luxury goods. Greek slave women were known as Yavani in North India or Yavannar in South India. Slavers were varied and included state-sponsored merchants, pirates, and even Indian soldiers serving as mercenaries in the Persian military. But the trafficking of Greek slaves to the subcontinent increased significantly with the Roman takeover of Egypt, which opened up direct shipping lanes to India. Ownership of Greek slaves was an indication of elite status in the subcontinent. In fact, Indian elites demonstrated their power and prestige through possessing a multitude of women from distant and exotic lands. Thus, foreign slaves were a sort of currency. Based on the historical record, for example, we know that Western merchants would often buy access to local markets in India by gifting Greek women as slaves. Greek slave women played many roles in society. In both North and South India, Greek women served as barmaids, musicians, dancers, concubines, actresses, and even armed bodyguards. Kalidasa, the legendary Sanskrit poet, wrote that the most desirable race for female bodyguards was Greek, though he was referring to women from all over the Hellenistic world. It's worth noting that regardless of their profession, Greek women are described as wearing clothes that were typical of their homeland. Historians believe that this indicates there was prestige to be gained in associating with an exotic foreign culture. Light skin, light hair, Greek dress, and other indications of foreign origin were highly valued. Number 7. Scientific exchange between Greeks and Indians. Many Greek scientific texts were translated into Sanskrit during late antiquity and the classical period. In the astronomical realm, consider the 5 astronomical canons in India around the 5th century CE. Of these 5 texts, 2 were Greek, the Palisa Siddhanta and the Romaka Siddhanta. The Palisa Siddhanta represents the Alexandrian school of astronomy, while the Romaka Siddhanta represents learnings by the astronomers of Byzantine Rome. Indian scholars believe themselves much superior to Westerners, but recognize Western expertise in the sciences, including astronomy. In the Garga Samhita, it is written, "The Yavanas are barbarians, yet the science of astronomy originated with them, and for this they must be honored." In the Brihat Samhita, an ancient Indian scientist named Varaha writes, "The Greeks, though impure, must be honored, since they are trained in the sciences, and therein exceeded others." More generally, the centuries-long intellectual movement in Alexandria, a legendary center of learning that blended Hellenistic, Roman, and Oriental influences, led to the transmission of new ideas to India, from geography to mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and medicine. The presence of Greek-speaking kingdoms in India enabled the translation of these texts to Sanskrit, and thus encouraged the rapid spread of foreign ideas and discoveries. Number 8. Western astrology meets Vedic astrology. Western Greek astrology has had a significant impact on Indian astrology. In fact, the zodiac signs were introduced to India by the Greeks. During the reign of the Western Kshatrapas, a Greek-speaking state that ruled over much of West India, a Greek astrological text was translated to Sanskrit and influenced the development of Indian Vedic astrology. This translated astrological text on horoscopy is known as the Yavana Jataka, or fortune-telling according to the Greeks, and was originally written around 120 CE in distant Alexandria, then ruled by the Roman Empire. It was translated from Greek to Sanskrit 30 years later by a man known as Yavaneshvara, or Lord of the Greeks, who served the Western Kshatrapas in Gujarat. This translation would become an authoritative text referenced by later astrological works in India. The Yavana Jataka makes allusions to Greek expertise in the context of horoscopy, all while honoring the work of native Indian sages who had their own procedures. Like other Indo-Greek powers, the Western Kshatrapas promoted translations from Greek to Sanskrit in an attempt to curry favor with powerful local hierarchies. This was an effective strategy, perhaps too effective. Towards the end of their long imperial history, the Western Kshatrapas had become so Indianized that even their coinage no longer contained real Greek words. Instead, their coinage contained pseudo-Greek letters meant only for visual stylization. That's a lot to consider, but it's fair to say that India and the Greco-Roman world was much more closely connected in ancient times than we've been led to believe. And now you know. Tibet is often seen through a lens tinted by its modern-day subjugation to China, but once upon a time, things were different. In the early medieval era, Tibetans were an ambitious, warlike people who struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. That might surprise you, but it shouldn't. Tibet was not always a land of smiling monks. It was a dynamic society full of romance and adventure. Mountain castles, fertile valleys, traveling scholars, scheming ministers, and rowdy taverns. And it was a meeting house of sorts, a place where many Silk Road cultures, Indian, Chinese, Persian, and others, crossed paths. Tibet deserves to have its story told, so let's get to it. This is the story of the rise of the Tibetan Empire, from humble beginnings to a geopolitical powerhouse. Until the early 7th century, the Tibetan plateau was dominated by an ever-shifting mosaic of warring clans. Early Tibetans were an aggressive people. In some regions, raiding formed an important part of the local economy. Tibetan clans made their homes in the fertile valleys of the plateau and built castles on rocky slopes to withstand long sieges. Constant inter-clan struggle defined the political landscape. Everything changed with the arrival of Namri Songtsen. Namri belonged to the Yarlung dynasty of the south and was more than just a normal clan chieftain. He was a Senpo, descended from a long line of kings with a divine mandate to rule. That being said, local clans ignored this mandate when it suited them. The Tibet that Namri inhabited was fractured. He built strong alliances with other clan leaders and eventually came up against his main rival, a charismatic chieftain known as Lord Zingpo, who had himself forged a broad alliance. After numerous battles, Namri prevailed. Namri absorbed Lord Zingpo's territories. By the end of Namri's reign, he had expanded his domain over the central and southern regions, the Tibetan heartland. But victory was a fragile thing. Namri was assassinated by poison, and his son, Songtsen Gampo, took the throne at just 13 years old. Soon, Lord Zingpo's former territories rose up in an insurgency, and the new teenage emperor was forced to come to terms with the power and problems he had inherited. Spoiler alert, Songtsen was more than ready for the challenge. Upon ascending the throne, the teenage Songtsen captured the traitor who poisoned his father and had him executed, then quickly put down the insurgency. After establishing domestic order, he rode west to subdue a hostile army causing trouble at the Tibetan border. Now an adult, it was time for Songtsen to build a true empire. There were still more lands to conquer: Zhangzhung, Aja, Nepal. As long as these buffer kingdoms remained, Tibet could not become a truly influential power in the region, for beyond these three kingdoms lay even greater opportunity. Whereas his father had been content to forge alliances with neighboring kingdoms, Songtsen had greater ambitions. He aimed to conquer them instead. Having established a new capital at Lhasa, he set about this long-term goal in comprehensive fashion. The 630s were an important decade for the growth of the Tibetan Empire. First, Songtsen married off one of his daughters to the king of Zhangzhou. She became extremely unhappy with her marriage, and after just a few years began to work as a spy for her father, sending him detailed reports of Zhangzhou royal and troop movements. Using this information, Songtsen sent an army to ambush the Zhangzhou king while he was away from his castle. The sneak attack was incredibly successful. Songtsen's army killed the Zhangzhou king and defeated his armies. All of their territories were absorbed into the growing Tibetan Empire. During this decade, Songtsen not only invited experts from India, but also sent emissaries to India to absorb the rich political, religious, and linguistic traditions of the subcontinent. For example, we know that a medical conference was held in Lhasa, and Indian physicians were invited to speak. According to Tibetan histories, Songtsen Gampo's minister, Donmi, traveled to India and devised the classical Tibetan script using various Indian scripts as a base. Donmi learned Indian writing systems from a renowned guru. His Indian guru gave him a new name, Sambhota, meaning the good Tibetan. After returning to Lhasa, Donmi taught the script to the aristocracy. This led to the creation of ongoing literary works, translations, court records, a constitution, and a codified administrative system with Buddhist legal overtones. Quick note, the administrative system implemented by Songtsen created a forced military draft with regional divisions that crossed beyond traditional clan borders. In many ways, the administrative system deteriorated the independent power of the clans, at least to some degree. But Songtsen wanted to position Tibet as a dominant political power in the subcontinent too. An opportunity opened up when the king of Nepal, Narendra-deva, was ousted in a coup and fled. Songtsen provided Narendra-deva and his court a decade-long exile in Lhasa. Fun fact, during this time, Nepali craftsmen in Lhasa helped construct Tibet's oldest Buddhist temple, the Jokhang Temple, featuring architectural elements typical of Nepal and the subcontinent. The Jokhang Temple still stands in Lhasa today, 1400 years later. By the beginning of the 640s CE, Songtsen was ready to take advantage of his strategic diplomacy. He gave the king in exile a Tibetan army, and Narendra-deva marched back to Nepal at the head of this army and took back his kingdom. In the process, Nepal also became a vassal of Tibet. This entrenched Tibet's position in the subcontinent, giving it access to active trade routes throughout North India. Now, let's jump to China. During the preceding decade, Songtsen also took steps towards establishing the beginnings of a Tibetan-Chinese relationship. In 634 CE, Songtsen sent an ambassador to the Tang Dynasty court in Chang'an. This ambassador did not get much accomplished, and so he was recalled. 4 years later, Songtsen sent his trusted prime minister, Gar Tongtsen, to request a Chinese bride to marry the Tibetan emperor. While Gar's request was being considered, a prince of the Aja kingdom made the very same request. At the time, the Tang emperor considered the Aja kingdom more important, as Aja raiders would routinely encroach upon Chinese lands. As such, the princess was promised to the Aja instead. Gar Tongtsen was sent home empty-handed. Songtsen Gampo saw this as an insult to his considerable success. He was important, and Tibet was certainly more worthy of China's respect than Aja. And so he sent his army, bolstered by troops from recently conquered Zhangzhou, into eastern and northern Tibet. Victory against the Aja, the Tanguts, and other eastern and northern groups quickly followed. Soon, the entire region was subdued. Now the Tibetan army was stationed on China's border, and Songtsen, in a position of strength, demanded the hand of the princess who had been promised to the Aja. He threatened to invade if his demand wasn't met. The Tang emperor was arrogant and ignorant as to the Tibetan empire's might. He rejected Songtsen's demands and sent an army against the Tibetans. Big mistake. His troops were easily defeated by the Tibetans, and China was put on notice. Tibet was a major power, and not to be taken lightly. In 641 CE, Gar Tongtsen was sent once again to Chang'an. Now pressured by the Tibetan military on his borders, the Tang emperor agreed to give his daughter to the Tibetan Senpo in marriage. Princess Wencheng traveled to Lhasa alongside Gar and his retinue. Songtsen Gampo was married to 6 women, 4 Tibetan natives and 2 foreigners. The 2 foreigners were Princess Wencheng of China and Princess Brikuti of Nepal. Each would play a role in influencing the future of the Tibetan Empire. Princess Brikuti is most known for her commitment to Buddhism and her patronage of temples and monasteries. Princess Wencheng's story is somewhat more involved. The marriage of Songtsen Gampo and Wencheng brought peace, soothing Tibetan-Chinese relations. But Wencheng also came bearing gifts, a royal retinue of nobles, scholars, artists, and craftsmen, and new technologies from China. She also encouraged Tibetans to take on Chinese dress and cultural norms, or so the Chinese histories say. Like Princess Brikati, Wencheng used her influence with Songtsen to patronize Buddhist temples, monasteries, and monuments throughout Tibet. Speaking of Buddhism, Songtsen Gampo is popularly known as the first Dharma king of Tibet, and it's during his reign that the Buddhist religion gained a foothold in the region. But it was only a foothold. By the end of Songtsen's reign, Buddhism's popularity was mostly limited to a small portion of the aristocracy. The practice of pre-Buddhist rituals and belief systems lingered. Eventually, this would lead to serious conflict. The 640s were a troubling decade for Songtsen. At some point in the early 640s, Songtsen stepped down and allowed his young heir, Gumsun Gumsan, to take the throne. Unfortunately, Gumsun died soon after taking the throne, forcing Songtsen to serve as emperor once again. Changing circumstances defined the twilight years of Songtsen's reign. In that era, Emperor Harsha of the Vardhan dynasty ruled over much of North India. Harsha had developed a strong diplomatic relationship with Tang China. Envoys regularly traveled between Harsha's empire and Tang China, with the route running through Tibet. Then, in 648 CE, there was a diplomatic crisis. An embassy of high-level Chinese envoys arrived in India, only to discover that Harsha had died, leaving behind a fractured North India. In Kanauj, the dynastic power vacuum had been taken up by a usurper king, Arunashva. Though the reason is not clear, Arunashva attacked and killed the Chinese envoys. Only 2 envoys survived and made an escape. One of these men was Wang Xuanxue, who was on good terms with the Tibetans. He fled to Lhasa. There, the Tibetan emperor, shrewd to changing politics, gave Wang an army to accompany him back into India. Songtsen's army defeated the upstart Indian king in battle and captured him. Arunashva was brought to Lhasa as a prisoner of war. According to the Book of Tang, as a thank you for helping Wang Xuanxue, the Chinese emperor bestowed numerous titles upon Songtsen and gifted him 3,000 rolls of silk. He was so gracious, in fact, that in 649 CE, he granted Songtsen's request for silkworm eggs, mortars and presses for making wine, and workmen to manufacture paper and ink. Now that's a valuable technology transfer. Just a year later, after proving Tibet's might, Songtsen died. His remaining heir, Mongsong Mongsan, was just 3 years old, a toddler, and so Prime Minister Gar Tongsen, yes, that one, stepped in to serve as regent. The Gar clan's moment had finally come. With Songtsen gone and the new Senpo just 3 years old, Gar Tongsen had the power and freedom to mold the Tibetan Empire to his vision. Luckily for Tibet, he was an impressive de facto leader. Chinese historical writings rave about Gar Tongsen. Although he was literate, he was naturally wise, resolute, strict, and honorable, a brave warrior and a skillful general, making him a most successful regent. His ambitions matched those of the deceased emperor. By 663 CE, the Aja had still not come fully under Tibetan control and returned to governing itself as an independent state. Gar Tongsen crushed the Aja and other groups in a decisive campaign that fully integrated the region into the Tibetan Empire. After this defeat, the Aja gradually became Tibetanized, taking on Tibetan language and culture. Censuses were conducted, imperial taxes were imposed, and armies were recruited. Aja was part of Tibet now. But Gar Tongsen was still not satisfied. He saw opportunity in the lucrative overland Silk Road. China controlled the Silk Road routes through distant colonial territories, and so Gar first sent Tibetan armies across the mountains into Kashmir, then, allying with the Turks, took the Kashgar region and Silk Road cities like Khotan. This cut off China's overland connection with India and Persia. From there, the Tibetans conquered much of the Tarim Basin. Fun fact, the Tibetan invasion of Khotan is associated with the abuse of Buddhism and its institutions. Khotanese records indicate that the red-faced warriors of Tibet desecrated its monasteries, stupas, and art, and burned its gardens. The Khotanese princess saved many structures by bribing Tibetans who were seen as being motivated more by monetary greed than anything else. Tibetans are portrayed in Khotanese writings as having the ambition to destroy the Buddhist religion. This may be surprising, but it's worth pointing out that, at the time, Tibetan interest in Buddhism was limited to the Lhasa aristocracy. Frontline soldiers would not have had any connection to Buddhism in that era. Anyways, back to Gar Tongsen. When Gar Tongsen died in 667 CE, the Senpo, Mongsong Mongsan, did not have the influence to oppose the de facto leadership of the Gar clan. Instead, Gar Tongsen's sons divided the empire amongst themselves and ruled each area as pseudo-independent warlords. Conflict between the Gar clan and the Senpo was inevitable. The power of the Gar clan would finally be broken by Songtsen Gampo's great-grandson, the Senpo known as Dusang. In the 690s, the descendants of Gar Tongsen began to lose their footing. First, Gar Senyang, the governor of Khotan, was defeated by Chinese forces, and so Dusang had him court-martialed and executed. Then Gar Tagu was captured by the Sogdians. Meanwhile, China regained control of the Tarim Basin and critical overland silk routes. Now there was only one son left with substantial power, Gar Trinring, who was campaigning with his armies on China's borders, though finding it difficult to compete with the revitalized China under Empress Wu Zetian. While Trinring was out in the field, Empress Wu Zetian offered a peace deal directly to Dusang and Lhasa. The peace deal was valuable to Dusang. He knew that accepting the peace deal would leave Trinring stranded in the borderlands, far from the center. Dusang accepted the peace deal. Then, in a clever move, he invited all the remaining members of the Gar clan to go hunting, except for Trinring, who was still in the field. During the hunting trip, Dusang had his soldiers spring a surprise attack on the Gar clan members in attendance. All were murdered as a result of this betrayal. Before Trinring could hear of the hunting fiasco, Dusang led an army into the field to meet Trinring at the border. Trinring's army was exhausted from years of warfare with the Chinese and was close to mutiny. Even if he wanted to fight, he could not win a battle against the fresh soldiers led by the Senpo. As Dusang and his army approached, Trinring committed suicide. The Senpo was back in control. As a well-connected trade empire, Tibet became a melting pot of global ideas, rituals, and technologies. But as the empire grew, it was Buddhism and the Indian subcontinent that would have the greatest, most defining influence on the future of Tibet. In the early 700s, there was discord in Tang China. The aristocracy blamed these problems on foreign monks who had become prominent in Chinese politics and administration. Rising xenophobia led to the expulsion of all foreign monks from China. Where did they flee? Lhasa, Tibet. In Tibet, the fleeing monks were welcomed with open arms by Princess Jin Cheng, a devout Chinese Buddhist who was married to the young Senpo. A refugee camp was set up in Lhasa, and a devoted Jin Cheng invited many more Buddhist refugees. Soon, monasteries were built for the monks, and the immigrant communities swelled. Resentment began to stir among native Tibetans. 3 years later, a deadly smallpox epidemic hit Tibet, likely brought in unknowingly by foreigners, such as the Buddhist refugees that were now part of the immigrant community in Lhasa. Blame was laid at their feet. Eventually, even Jin Cheng contracted smallpox and died, leaving the foreigners without an advocate. The government ordered that all foreign monks leave Tibet. Though some Tibetans supported the foreign monks, they were not the majority. Anti-Buddhist sentiment festered in the wake of expulsion, and in the 740s, laws were passed against Buddhist practice. The young Senpo grew into an old, bearded man, Me Agtson, and though the Tibetan Empire seemed stable from the outside, the court swirled with intrigue. Me Agtson was killed by assassins hired by 2 clan leaders. Just when it seemed as though the Senpos would disappear, the greatest of the Tibetan emperors took the throne and changed the future of the region forever. Trisong Detsen inherited a Tibet on the brink of civil war, and one in which the control of the Silk Road routes had been lost to China. Despite this, he declared Buddhism the state religion of Tibet. This was a brilliant strategic move. Most of the anti-Buddhist sentiment was propagated by elites that also opposed him taking the throne. Thus, he distanced his opponents from the political center. Meanwhile, the Anlushan rebellion weakened China considerably. There was now an opening for Tibet to retake the Silk routes and expand outward even further. The Tibetan Empire was standing on the precipice of a golden age. And now you know. In 1757, the British East India Company won the Battle of Plassey and took control of the wealthy region of Bengal. The company, a private corporation using contracted foot soldiers, now governed more people than the English crown. Just over a century later, the British controlled the majority of the Indian subcontinent, either directly or through princely states. What began as a trading mission transformed into total domination. The rest of Asia fared no better. But why didn't history play out differently? Why didn't Indian powers have the political, economic, and military wherewithal to resist European colonization? Why wasn't 1757 marked by Bengali soldiers sieging and taking London? And more broadly, how did the West become so much more powerful than the East? Historians have pondered these questions for centuries, but while there's no perfect answer, new scholarship is painting us a more complete picture. Let's focus on the period from the late 1400s to the late 1700s, the age in which Europe began to push outward. In 1453 CE, the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, cementing their power. Meanwhile, the Mamluks controlled the Red Sea. These Near East powers established a tight stranglehold over the Silk Road trade routes. Europeans salivated over the profits Near East middlemen made trading with the rest of Asia. Indian textiles, Chinese porcelain, Indonesian spices. This inspired the great powers of Europe to establish a direct trade with Asia that would circumvent the Ottomans and Mamluks entirely. But the Europeans were minor players in the global economy at this time. The prosperous Asian powers had no incentive to establish a direct trade with distant Europe. And so it was Europe who would have to seek out Asia, not the other way around. This would lead to some fascinating developments. Consider the Iberians, Spain and Portugal. There were only two options for circumventing Ottoman and Mamluk intervention: round the coast of Africa, or sail west into the unknown. In the mid-15th century, Portugal was suffering from scarce wood supplies. In response, the Portuguese crown encouraged the construction of larger, more efficient vessels by providing tax benefits to shipbuilders who built big. And so shipbuilders in Portugal began to develop larger vessels. They also incorporated innovative new shipbuilding technologies from neighboring North Africa. This led to the production of massive ocean-going vessels that could be fitted with heavy cannons, perfect for a long intercontinental journey. Using these vessels, the Portuguese were able to round the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and reach Asia. Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama arrived on the Indian coast, making direct contact with Indian powers for the first time. Using similar vessels, the Spanish, also attempting to find a route to India that would circumvent the Ottomans, bumped into the New World. Jackpot! The discovery of the New World flooded European markets with silver, which would soon have an enormous impact on the dynamics between Europe and Asia. The sudden excess of silver made Europeans very attractive trading partners for Asian powers, who were facing a systemic silver shortage. In fact, records indicate that the silver shortage in Asia was responsible for a number of political crises across the continent, and so European merchants arriving in the East essentially bought their way into Asian trade hegemony using their newfound silver supply.
Hey.
With Europeans establishing a direct trade, a new dynamic had formed. Asia generated products in demand in Europe, and Europeans paid for those products with silver. As they had an abundance of silver on hand, Europeans had become ideal trading partners. For example, the first British trading post in India, Fort St. George near Chennai, was actually encouraged by the local Polygar lord, who so badly wanted the British trading there that he offered to pay for half the construction cost. He also offered military protection and tax privileges. It's important to understand that Europeans adopted a conciliatory policy towards Asian great powers. In fact, early records reveal that the Europeans respected, feared, and even admired their most significant Asian counterparts: the Mughals, the Qing, the Vijayanagara Empire, the Tokugawa Shogunate, and others. According to a Dutch official in Japan in 1707, to show our teeth or to use violence is completely impossible unless we want to leave this land and never come again. Europeans willingly operated on the fringe and avoided direct confrontation with the Asian great powers. But maritime city-states, they could be targeted. From the 1500s to the mid-1700s, the European focus on maritime exploits played to their strengths. With massive cannon-fitted ships, Europeans had an advantage in most naval battles. They could also lay siege to fortified coastal cities. Thus, early Europeans, like the Portuguese, limited their aggression to small coastal enclaves. This was not a problem for the Indian great powers. At times, they even encouraged European aggression. Surprise! In 1510 CE, the Vijayanagara Empire assisted the Portuguese in taking Goa from the Bijapur Sultanate. In fact, Vijayanagara even sent an allied pirate leader with 5,000 soldiers under his command to help the Portuguese take Goa. Goa was the hub of the maritime horse trade. To the Vijayanagara Empire, it was preferable for the horse trade to be controlled by the neutral Portuguese than for it to be controlled by a rival sultanate. So, we know that the dynamic between the European and Asian powers was largely cooperative from the 1500s to the mid-1700s. Though much fanfare has been made about early European aggression, it was constrained to small coastal enclaves and only with the explicit or implicit permission of Asian great powers. But this dynamic would not last forever. Starting in the mid-1700s, more than 2 centuries after Vasco da Gama landed in South India, the Europeans did begin to aggressively expand. How did they transform their trading networks into colonial empires? Let's keep our lens pointed at India for now. Number 1. European institutions were stable enough that they outlasted their strongest rivals. In India, for example, the British were active for more than a century before Mughal power finally waned. The Mughals were replaced by the Marathas, Hyderabadis, Bengalis, Sikhs, Rajputs, Mysoreans, and others. With imperial power in India split between so many different entities, the British began to assemble the building blocks of a colonial empire. Number 2. European officials couldn't be easily bribed to switch sides. Though the agents of European trading companies did regularly accept bribes, they could not be easily bribed into treasonous activity. Why? Problematic European officials could simply be replaced. They had no independent political power. By contrast, Indian lords were easily bribed to switch sides, and most Indian soldiers were bound to their lord through land or clan ties. As such, disloyal Indian lords could not simply be replaced. They had independent political power. Number 3. Europeans were not risking much by fighting far away from home. When Europeans lost battles in Asia, it did not threaten their civilizational existence, or even their mission. They could simply regroup and reinforce. But when an Indian power lost battles, it could lead to total collapse. Indian powers were especially vulnerable to a total and sudden collapse due to the domino effect of local lords switching sides. This is a well-established historical pattern. The Mauryas, Guptas, Chalukyas, Pallavas, Vijayanagar, the list of sudden imperial collapses in Indian history goes on and on. Number 4. European militaries had superior organizational discipline. Military developments in Europe led to drill tactics and high organizational discipline. This was made even more possible by the fact that Europeans used regulars, full-time professional soldiers. Though not universally the case, many Indian militaries had not yet established this level of organizational discipline, as their soldiers were not full-time. On Bengali soldiers, their mode of fighting is crowding without any order and in great confusion. In imitation of their European neighbors, they form into something resembling battalions, but it is of little use. Their bravery does not compensate for their deficiency in discipline and tactics. Number 5. Europeans used local soldiers. By the mid-1700s, European armies in India fielded mostly local soldiers, ensuring that they were not at a numerical disadvantage. How did that happen? European trading companies and governments offered regular pay and pensions to soldiers who would fight for them. In India, this attracted skilled local soldiers who preferred guaranteed, timely compensation. By contrast, Indian powers granted feudal lords land and tax assessment rights, and through that system, soldiers would eventually be paid. But this system was high risk and created additional bureaucracy. Indian soldiers would sometimes be left unpaid or underpaid. Many Indian soldiers saw European military contracts as desirable. They chose to fight as regulars for the various East India trading companies, serving under European officers. How did the Europeans develop these advantages, while Indians did not? The answer lies in a revolution hundreds of years in the making. The military revolution hypothesis is based on the idea that artillery innovations in late medieval Europe led to sweeping changes in society, some of which would prove advantageous for building colonial empires. Side note, India did go through a mini military revolution in response to new artillery developments too. Check out my video on Indian gunpowder empires for details. Okay, back to the European military revolution. In the 1400s, new cannons were introduced that could break medieval castle walls, and so European rulers scrambled for a solution. This led to a new style of artillery-resistant fortifications, with angled bastions and intersecting fields of fire, known as star fortresses. Star fortresses were very expensive to build, and required a large and costly army to garrison or attack. In fact, successful sieges could take years. These developments led to spectacular increases in budgets, taxes, and staffs. European lords that were unable to manage these rising costs were eventually conquered by those with a centralized administrative apparatus that could raise more money. The pressure to centralize and extend the state apparatus consumed many smaller feudal lords. The European nation-states were born, giving rise to many financial, logistical, and administrative innovations. And so they suddenly found themselves advantaged. Consider the ocean-going warships that enabled European powers to establish maritime supremacy. Here's a little-known fact. The great powers of the East did have the technological know-how to build ocean-going warships with heavy cannons. But the devil is in the details. Like star fortresses, ocean-going warships were very expensive, which reinforced pressures for more tax revenue and more intrusive state intervention. But in India, native powers were not sufficiently centralized. Maintaining a competitive naval fleet was simply implausible. Imperial powers like the Mughals and Vijayanagar did maintain navies. In fact, Vijayanagar used their navy to bully Pegu and Lanka into paying tribute. But to build a fleet that could counter the Europeans, Indian great powers would have had to take more direct control over their coastal feudatories. They would also have had to spend imperial resources on ships as opposed to land armies. In the Indian context, they had more pressing concerns: land wars against ambitious Indian rivals. It was a lose-lose situation in the long term, unless Indian powers could figure out a way to centralize their administrations and rid themselves of feudal hierarchies. Despite European aggression in the early to mid-1700s, the true shift in power began with the Industrial Revolution. Starting in the mid to late 1700s, European development rapidly outstripped that of the rest of the world and gave rise to roughly 2 centuries of global dominance. What was the recipe for this great divergence? 1 cup luck, 1 pinch policy. Let's compare the wood and coal situation in England, India, and Japan in the 1700s. In India, there were plentiful forests. As such, there were sufficient wood resources to fuel a vibrant economy. There was no need to switch to the use of coal as a power source. In England and Japan, however, wood had been over-harvested. Interestingly, the British and the Japanese approached the problem in very different ways. The Japanese sought to fix the ecological damage. They imposed very strict laws, including capital punishment for wood harvesting without a license. These policies were successful. Soon, healthy forests returned and the normal use of wood could continue. By contrast, the British didn't try to fix anything. England simply switched to the use of coal. It helped that the coal deposits existed close to London, the manufacturing center of England at the time. The English didn't know that their reliance on coal would unlock the Industrial Revolution. They didn't predict the steam engine, power loom, or high production factories. It was a lucky break that fueled an industrial revolution. And thanks to strong protectionist policies, British industries were healthy enough to take advantage of new commercial technology, like the mechanized power loom. By the early 1800s, the British textile industry was able to produce at such a high volume and at such a low cost that they outcompeted the entire Indian textile industry, which was the world's largest producer of textile. But Indian powers did not have the time to properly react. They were under fire from both colonial forces and opportunistic neighbors. Every year, industrial Europe grew more powerful, and the gap between the West and the rest of the world grew larger. Conquered Indians were not useful to the British as producers or innovators. They were now only useful as raw material providers and customers. And so the Indian subcontinent, and many other parts of Asia, was rapidly deindustrialized while Europe flourished. But the world never stands still. Today, the East is securing its historical position at the top of the global power hierarchy, ending the West's 200-year term. Got some exciting news for the channel. I know a lot of you have been asking about whether I'm going to start a Patreon. I've actually gone ahead and started a Creator Guild page. On Creator Guild, you can support me in a number of different ways, from making custom requests to leaving tips. It's a really interesting platform, so if you'd like to support the channel, go check it out. 3 crores to bring your mouth close to mine, touch my lips and kiss, to hug me tight, to touch my place of love, and get to total union. Listen well, you must bathe me in a shower of gold. Courtesans are deeply rooted in the historical fabric of India, from ancient times to the colonial era. Whether they served as concubines, dancing girls, musicians, actresses, or sex workers, these women had a surprising impact on the world around them. For among the courtesans of India were those whose honeyed lips changed the fates of empires and influenced the culture of the subcontinent forever. First, it's important to clarify, not all courtesans were involved in prostitution. In India, courtesans were a particular category of women who were not expected to have a traditional married life. Courtesans who served as concubines or musicians or dancing girls or actresses would not necessarily have been considered prostitutes, but they would also not have lived like others in society. For example, they wouldn't have had a husband, barring a few notable exceptions. That being said, many Indian courtesans were engaged in at least part-time sex work, just like the courtesans of other cultures. In feudal Japan, for example, actresses would perform theater and would then be hired for the night by wealthy suitors. This sort of arrangement would not have been unfamiliar to an Indian courtesan. A system of prostitution is a feature of an advanced, prosperous society. After all, the profession relies on a substantial economic surplus, much of which is generated through trade and commerce. And extensive commerce demands a complex and stable political infrastructure. Unsurprisingly, systemic prostitution thrived in places like ancient Greece and ancient India. In India, there are references to prostitution as a social institution as early as the 8th century BCE. There are even more detailed references some hundreds of years after that, in early Buddhist literature, especially the Jatakas. There, we find detailed discussions as to the categories of courtesans, their services, fees, and position in society. How courtesans entered this lifestyle is quite varied. Some would do so voluntarily, of course, but others were given as gifts. Others were born to courtesans. Still others were sold into courtesanship due to financial distress, or were abducted, or even won as war booty. Courtesans could be delineated into a number of different categories. Some of these categories may seem rather strange given our modern sensibilities. There were concubines and live-in mistresses, and there were common public women who sold their services on the street and in their homes. Vandaki were housewives turned prostitutes whose husbands were dependent on their earnings. Randa were pilgrim women pretending to be engaged in penance. They were typically older prostitutes hunting for customers at religious sites. These colorful characters notwithstanding, the most prominent courtesans were the Rupajava and Ganaka. Rupajava were courtesan prostitutes whose value was premised mainly on their beauty and charm. By contrast, the Ganaka were a rank of courtesans who were not only expected to be beautiful and charming, but were also accomplished in the arts and intellectual pursuits. As the status of household women deteriorated by the early centuries BCE, the accomplished Ganaka became especially attractive to cultured men about town, known as Nagarika. Nagarika were typically merchants, nobles, administrators, and military lords, the sort of men who would be able to pay the exorbitant fees demanded by high-end courtesans. Some of the most learned women in Indian society would have been courtesans. In Jain literature, we find exhaustive lists of what a Ganaka was expected to learn, including arithmetic, writing, chess, music making, perfume making, horse riding, cooking, camping, sword fighting, and omen reading. Altogether, 72 skills were to be mastered by a Ganaka, and they put these skills to good use. At the height of the Vijayanagara Empire, for example, a genre of erotic poetry referencing Krishna as a mischievous customer was popularized by courtesans who had a talent for the written word. Many of these poems have been preserved in the Tirupati temple vaults in Andhra Pradesh. In fact, there is plenty of reason to believe that courtesans in India were valued for their artistic and intellectual achievements, and not solely as sexual objects. As Altekar writes, courtesans had a peculiar position in ancient India. As persons who had sacrificed what was regarded as honorable in a woman, they were held in low estimation. But society treated them with a certain amount of consideration as the custodians of fine arts. Men who had a liking or love for music and dancing and poetry could not delight in the company of their own wives, who had ceased to possess these accomplishments from 400 BCE. Though despised in one sense, courtesans began to be respected for their achievements in the fine arts. Aside from the fact that some courtesans were expected to be highly educated, they were involved in a multitude of public and private functions. Courtesans would also be brought along on hunting and military expeditions. In 1520 CE, at the Battle of Raichur, for example, Krishna-Devaraya brought along thousands of courtesans to entertain his troops at camp. Broadly speaking, courtesans were entertainers. From various texts, we know that they would perform at festivals, garden parties, boat trips, musical soirees, and other venues. They also served as party hosts themselves for discussions not unlike those of the French salons that captured the world's imagination in the 1700s and 1800s. At-homes could be held in a courtesan salon, where assembled were men of the same age, intellect, and wealth. These men would hold discussions with one another and with the courtesans. This was called gosti, where they talked about poetry and art and indulged in food and drink. The kingdoms and empires of India were invested in training up and maintaining courtesans for a multitude of reasons. Substantial taxes were collected from brothel courtesans and freelance courtesans alike, even those who were being paid to be the mistress of a single client. Textual sources indicate a 25 to 30% tax rate on courtesan services, with that number rising to 50% in times of administrative crisis. As an accomplished and attractive courtesan could generate considerable revenues, the state undertook to supervise courtesan education at its own expense. Those who teach prostitutes, female slaves, and actresses the arts, such as singing, musicianship, reading, dancing, acting, writing, painting, mental acuity, the manufacture of scents and garlands, shampooing, and the art of attracting and captivating the minds of others, shall be endowed with maintenance from the state. These state-funded teachers would also be tasked with training the sons of prostitutes to be chief actors on the stage. Interestingly, courtesans, actors, and their relatives would also be trained in spycraft. They were taught how to conduct counterintelligence operations against foreigners, such as visiting diplomats, and how to identify local criminals for police. Courtesan-related services were not their only contribution to society, however. Records in many South Indian temples show that the Devadasi courtesans there made rich endowments. In Buddhist texts, there are many references to courtesan charity. Courtesans fed the hungry during famines and gave away property to monastic orders. The courtesan Amrapali gave away her vast wealth to charitable institutions and laid a vast sum at the Buddha's feet. In Jain texts, we hear of many generous courtesans who were invested in the public good. One ran a picture gallery, while others gave vast sums to the poor. When the courtesans grow rich, they often set up works of public utility such as wells, temples, tanks, gardens, groves, bridges, and they gave away food and rice. What does this tell us? Many courtesans were not only wealthy, but they were in control of that wealth and they could decide how to spend it. These women are of loose character and they live in the best streets that there are in the city. They are very much esteemed and are classed amongst those honored ones who are the mistresses of the captains. Any respectable man may go to their houses without any blame. High-end courtesans were extremely wealthy and politically influential. First-hand accounts observe that their wealth even exceeded that of landed nobility. Well-to-do courtesans also kept slaves and employees to assist them. Many courtesans would employ a vira, a man who would look after her physical interests. He would escort her at night, provide security, and act as a go-between and goods procurer. Some courtesans would also share a portion of their earnings with a matron, who would help her with negotiations, help navigate administrative issues, and much more. Given the high demand for entertainment services, Ganakas would often maintain a troupe of singers, dancing girls, and artists to entertain at larger parties and festivals. These assistants were known as Ganakadasi and could later become independent courtesans. Ganakas also had maidservants or slaves who would help with house duties, makeup, hair, and fashion. In the Samajataka, for example, the document notes that Sama, a courtesan, had a retinue of 500 female slaves under her command. Ownership of slaves was not merely an ancient practice. For example, medieval sources in India note that Vijayanagar's wealthy courtesans often made use of female slaves as personal assistants and co-entertainers. Besides the advantage of their earning potential, courtesans also enjoyed the protection of the state. Those who harmed them, physically, financially, or socially, were liable to be punished in accordance with special laws created to protect courtesans. In the Arthashastra, Kautilya notes that a state-endorsed official, the superintendent of prostitutes, conferred the title of Ganaka to a select group of courtesans who were pretty, youthful, and cultured. After being granted this title, a Ganaka would be entitled to funds from the state to establish herself. Kautilya seems to have harbored no ill will towards courtesans, and in fact was adamant that they be provided for by the state. In the Arthashastra, he recommends that courtesans be given state pensions so as to take care of them after the loss of their youth, beauty, and entertainment skills. The possibility of courtesans falling in love was accepted by Vatsyayana, though he advises them to chase after money and influence, not love. In both Indian literature and recorded history, we find ample evidence of courtesans reaching the highest rung of society by securing the hearts of great kings, nobles, merchants, and others. For example, the legendary Vijayanagara Emperor Krishnadevaraya was the son of Tuluva Narsanayaka and his beloved concubine Nagamamba. In fact, Krishnadevaraya's status as the son of a lowly concubine should have disqualified him from becoming Vatsyayana, though he had ill will towards courtesans, and in fact was adamant that they be provided for by the state. In the Arthashastra, he recommends that courtesans be given state pensions so as to take care of them after the loss of their youth, beauty, and entertainment skills. The possibility of courtesans falling in love was accepted by Vatsyayana, though he advises them to chase after money and influence, not love. In both Indian literature and recorded history, we find ample evidence of courtesans reaching the highest rung of society by securing the hearts of great kings, nobles, merchants, and others. For example, the legendary Vijayanagara Emperor Krishnadevaraya was the son of Tuluva Narsanayaka and his beloved concubine Nagamamba. In fact, Krishnadevaraya's status as the son of a lowly concubine should have disqualified him from becoming emperor, were it not for the fact that his half-brother instated him as his successor on his deathbed. Once he was made emperor, Krishnadevaraya then married the love of his life, a low-caste dancing girl known as Chinna Devi, with whom he'd carried on a secret relationship prior to ascending the throne. Krishnadevaraya married Chinna Devi and made her a queen, the queen he adored above all others. In North India, similar histories abound. Among the Rajputs, for example, Raja Samant Singh fell in love with a beautiful courtesan, Banithani, who was a singer employed by his stepmother. Their love blossomed due to her beauty and their mutual interest in the arts. The Raja made Banithani his mistress, and later married her and made her a queen. In the Kashmiri erotic text Kalavilasa, a story is told of a courtesan, Vilasavati, with whom King Vikramaditya fell in love. In this story, King Vikramaditya lost his kingdom and fell on hard times. He stayed with Vilasavati as a guest, and it was Vilasavati who, with her extensive contacts and powerful networks, helped Vikramaditya regain his kingdom. Returning the favor, Vikramaditya married her and made her his chief queen. But the story doesn't end there. Vilasavati was in fact in love with another man, a young thief who was imprisoned. She confessed to her husband Vikramaditya, and he accepted it. He freed the young thief and allowed the two lovers to be united. How did courtesans in India avoid getting pregnant and giving birth? In the Indian subcontinent, ancient and medieval peoples used many different methods of birth control. For example, the ancient trade in silphium, a popular and extremely effective contraceptive in the Roman Empire, almost certainly reached Indian shores. However, the expense and rarity of silphium, which went extinct in the 400s CE, made it an unsustainable solution. Other plants belonging to the same giant fennel family, such as Asafoetida, were cheaper and more readily available. Lab tests show that they have potential as a contraceptive. Meanwhile, in Indian erotic manuals, there are references to the Queen Anne's lace plant, which has contraceptive qualities. Other references include a consumable mixture made of powdered palm leaf and red chalk. As in Egypt and China, pessaries were used as a means of physically blocking conception. One popular pessary was made of honey, diluted rock salt, ghee, and ground fennel seeds. When mixed together and heated, it creates a spermicidal solution rather comparable to those sold in pharmacies today. Certainly, the popularity of erotic manuals indicate that the birth control methods used in ancient and medieval India were likely effective. While imperfect, these methods would have provided courtesans at least some control over pregnancy. If you like these videos, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. It really helps the channel out. I've also made a Creator Guild profile, so go check that out. You can leave tips, make custom requests, purchase unique offers. It's a really interesting platform, so we'd love to see you there. In 325 BCE, as Alexander retreated from India, an ambitious Indian scholar watched the proceedings with great interest. This scholar, Chanakya, had set his eyes on the throne of the hated king of the Nandas. How convenient that Alexander's invasion had shaken up the political landscape. By 323 BCE, Chanakya had secured enough funds to hire a Greek mercenary army. Conquest was on the horizon. But Chanakya did not intend the throne for himself. Instead, he planned to depose Dhanananda and place his own puppet claimant on the throne, Chandragupta Maurya. In the end, Chanakya succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. It was his hand that puppeteered the growth of the Mauryan Empire, the largest native power in Indian history. And in Chanakya's famous treatise Arthashastra, he codified a pragmatic system of statecraft, a Machiavellian system that would be adopted throughout India and Southeast Asia. This is his story. Chanakya was born to a scholarly Jain family sometime in the 4th century BCE. From there, accounts differ. The Jain account notes that he was from Dramala, an area that today encompasses the southern states of India. However, recent linguistic evidence has led some historians to believe that Chanakya originated from the western coast. In most accounts, Chanakya is described as having broken teeth, and this is tied to his destiny as the power behind the throne. Broken-toothed Chanakya was soon married off to a traditional Brahmin lady. Surprise, surprise, his in-laws suddenly started fussing. For Chanakya was educated, yes, but he was poor, so Chanakya headed north seeking opportunity, to Patliputra, capital of the prosperous Nanda Empire. An opportunity there was. Chanakya found work as a courtly advisor and administrator for the king, Dhanananda. However, at some point, Chanakya was profoundly insulted by the king or lost his job. Chanakya swore revenge. He would topple the dynasty and help establish a new one on the ashes. But first, he would need a claimant with which he could challenge Dhanananda. How convenient that in the forest near the capital, Chanakya found a descendant of the original Nanda dynasty, Chandragupta. But to understand the value of Chandragupta to Chanakya, we have to understand Dhanananda's story. See, Dhanananda was descended from a low-born barber who was the favorite plaything of a previous queen. Sensing an opportunity, the barber, who had ingratiated himself with certain court officials, instigated a coup. Afterwards, he took the queen's children in as their guardian, and one by one had them killed too. Dhanananda was a descendant of the barber and this queen. The record makes it clear that his low birth and the violent, unjustified nature of his ancestors' coup made him an easy target for hatred, worsened by high taxes and an oppressive administration. In fact, Porus told Alexander that Dhanananda was so widely despised that he could have captured the Nanda Empire were he to continue deeper into India. This is where Chandragupta comes in. From the historical record, it appears that Chandragupta could have been the son of a lesser wife of an older Nanda king. In other words, he had a connection to the Nanda dynasty before the coup. In order to escape the violence of the coup, Chandragupta and his mother went to the forest to live in obscurity. According to the legends, Chanakya ventured into the forest and found Chandragupta as a child. He supposedly knew that Chandragupta was the rightful heir, for the boy was playing king with his friends. Chanakya became Chandragupta's guardian. Together, they left for Takshila. Takshila was a frontier city in the subcontinent and a vibrant center of learning and trade. And after Alexander's retreat from India, the city was teeming with disaffected Greeks and Persians. It was Takshila where Chanakya would change his fortunes and build the foundation of his imperial legacy. While in Takshila, Chanakya is believed to have taught at the prestigious Takshila University and personally tutored Chandragupta, developing him into a polished, kingly figure. But Chanakya did not dither. In Takshila, he actively sought allies to help him take down Dhanananda and establish a new empire. According to various records, Chanakya came to a great deal of wealth very suddenly. Most of the records attribute this to some sort of fantastical magic power. In reality, however, it's likely that Chanakya obtained war loans from merchant guilds. Obtaining war loans was common in India. Money in hand, Chanakya first secured the allegiance of Greek mercenaries in Takshila, and then he struck a deal with the Himalayan king, Parvataka. To sweeten the deal, he offered Parvataka half the empire once they succeeded in toppling it. Now backed by a large army of mercenaries and partnered kings, Chanakya and his allies conquered a large chunk of the northwest and looked to the empire of the Nandas next. Beyond Tachila, conquest would not be easy. According to Hindu and Jain sources, the war campaign against the Nandas was bitterly fought because the Nandas had a powerful and well-trained army. Chanakya and his allies launched a direct attack on Patliputra. This was a bold move, but Chanakya's gamble did not pay off. The attack failed, and the allied forces were forced to retreat. Battered and bruised, they soon realized that they should have first secured a more favorable position on the periphery of the empire, slowly deconstructing the Nandas piece by piece. With the new strategy in place, the allied forces invaded the border provinces of the Nandas. As the allied forces took these provinces, they strengthened their position, filled their garrisons, and induced minor lords into joining their cause. Finally, the allied forces sieged Patliputra once more. This time, they were successful. As per usual, accounts differ. Some say that Chanakya and his allies killed Dhanananda, while others say that they spared the old king but forced him into exile. Chandragupta now sat on the throne in Patliputra, having toppled the Nanda dynasty and having founded a new imperial dynasty, the Mauryas. The situation was not yet ideal, however. He would have to share this conquest with the Himalayan king Parvataka, his most important ally. Parvataka suddenly fell sick with poison and died. Many accounts attribute this poisoning to Chanakya, who is believed to have blamed some of his own allies as part of a larger scheme. With Chanakya advising him as prime minister, Chandragupta established an expansive and prosperous empire. In 2 short generations, it would grow into the largest native empire in Indian history, fueled by the instability of North India at the time. In the wake of Alexander the Great's invasion, he'd left much of northwest India under the control of semi-independent Greek satraps. These satraps faced the constant threat of rebellion. After all, many local lords seethed at the fact that their position had been usurped by distant foreigners. Chandragupta and Chanakya exploited this vulnerability. They made extensive use of guerrilla tactics, working with hill tribes and other groups to cause instability in the Greek satraps. Soon enough, the expanding Mauryan Empire bordered the eastern flank of the largest post-Alexander Greek kingdom, that of Seleucus Nicator. War was inevitable. In 305 BCE, the Seleucids attempted an invasion of the subcontinent. The Mauryans were drawn into conflict and soundly defeated the invading Greeks. Tired of the border tensions, the 2 powers agreed to a peace treaty. Seleucus would receive 500 war elephants, while Chandragupta would be given the remaining Greek territories in India. To strengthen the peace, Seleucus also gave away his daughter, Helena, to Chandragupta in marriage. Now that their attention could be turned elsewhere, the Mauryans looked to the east and south. Until Chandragupta's death in 297 BCE, the Mauryans expanded across North India from the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal, and even consolidated territories past the Vindhya mountain range and into the Deccan region. Eventually, the majority of South India was conquered, with the sole exception of Tamil country. From the historical record, it's not clear whether it was Chandragupta himself or his son Bindusara who was responsible for this southern conquest. Either way, by the time his grandson Ashoka had taken the throne, most of the Indian subcontinent had come under Mauryan imperial authority. Chanakya implemented far-reaching policies that made the empire prosperous and powerful. First, he developed a strong central administration, in stark contrast to the splintered kingdoms of the past. Parallel government structures were developed to help the state administer the unique needs of rural and urban areas separately, and the military was important enough that an entire administrative body was created to supervise it. Commerce was encouraged. It's clear that Chanakya believed in the power of economic competition. For example, the state monopolized weapons manufacturing centers, but allowed private mining operators to bid and compete for the right to supply these weapon centers. Tax breaks spurred economic activity, and the state limited taxes on overburdened citizens. Interestingly, Chanakya wrote that limiting taxes was done out of fear of revolt, not generosity or ideological commitment. The Mauryan Empire undertook massive infrastructure projects, such as a road system that connected major urban centers throughout the empire. These projects not only enabled faster troop movements, thus enabling the administration of such a large, centralized empire, but also allowed for easier commerce and internal migration.
With Chanakya as prime minister, the Mauryans also implemented a number of protections that would today be considered quite progressive. The state made provisions for certain groups who could not adequately provide for themselves: pregnant women, the elderly, the disabled, and those living in areas struck by environmental catastrophe. In keeping with his progressive nature, Chanakya also believed that people had a right to divorce and remarriage, and that the state should not overly prohibit this practice, not even for widowed spouses. In 285 BCE, once Chanakya grew too old for his position as prime minister, he retired and began to write down his thoughts and learnings. He wrote 3 works: Arthashastra, Chanakya Niti, and the Chanakya Sutra. The Niti and Sutra are general works, full of proverbs and other glimpses of earthly wisdom, and were popular in their own right. In fact, references to the Niti were made more than 2,000 years after Chanakya's death. But for now, let's focus on the Arthashastra. What is the Arthashastra exactly? On the surface, the Arthashastra is a comprehensive treatise on economics and statecraft. It's written in the style of an advice book for kings, especially those who have the ambition to become world conquerors. The subject matter of the Arthashastra is varied. It is split into 15 books and over 180 different governance-related topics, from taxation to espionage and resource politics. Everything about the Arthashastra screams pragmatism, even the straightforward writing style, which Chanakya takes a moment to acknowledge. He almost seems to take pride in the fact that he's not a talented writer. Below the surface, the Arthashastra is a guide to securing and maintaining absolute political power. This is seen as both necessary and ethical in the world that Chanakya inhabits, an India akin to medieval Europe, rife with conflict. Chanakya saw the attainment of power as the only path to peace and prosperity, and in fact believed that Artha was worth pursuing over immaterial objectives like Dharma, Kama, and Moksha. Chanakya explains that there cannot be a pursuit of Dharma without Artha. This perspective stands in stark contrast to the religious philosophers of his day. With a stable government, the people are protected from exploitation and are free to pursue Dharma, Kama, and Moksha. For in the absence of the magistrate, the strong will swallow the weak, but under his protection, the weak resist the strong. Unsurprisingly, modern scholarship is divided because it's possible to read Chanakya as both radically amoral and as an ethical realist. But modern scholars are not the only ones struggling with this. There's seemingly never been a historical consensus. In the first half of the 7th century CE, the Sanskrit writer Banabhatta wrote, "Is there anything that is righteous for those whom the science of Chanakya, merciless in its precepts, rich in cruelty, is an authority?" What is clear is that Chanakya was not an outright moralist, nor was he particularly religious. Academic analysis has revealed that the existing Arthashastra manuscripts are actually compiled works. The portions attributable to Chanakya are almost entirely lacking a religious or moral quality. The religious portions were added later, many centuries after Chanakya's death, by conservative Brahmins who likely found his perspectives to be problematic. After all, the Arthashastra has a cynical view of religion. It advocates for rulers to manipulate religion for political purposes. It also criticizes astrology and fortune-telling as deeply fraudulent, and discourages kings from making decisions by reading the stars. The treatise also goes into great lengths on how to conduct espionage. Chanakya recommends the use of state spies for a variety of purposes, both at home and abroad. Gathering information, tricking enemies, generating rumors, assassinations, and more. Ever the amoral pragmatist, Chanakya insists that a king keep track of his own people, and notes that many members of society should be on the state's payroll for this purpose. For example, he directs a king to pay servants and courtesans to spy on nobles in the hopes of discovering sensitive information that could be used for blackmail. He also recommends using the affections of beautiful courtesans to sow discord among one's opponents. Counter-espionage was a consideration too, and Chanakya was rather paranoid. He moved Chandragupta's bedroom every few days to confuse potential assassins. He is also believed to have secretly put small amounts of poison in Chandragupta's food to help build poison immunity. As Chandragupta was not privy to this strategy, he unknowingly shared his food with his pregnant wife, who died. Rushing against the clock, Chanakya ordered that her womb be cut open and the baby was saved. This baby, heir to the throne, was born with a drop of poison having touched his forehead, and so he was named Bindusara, meaning the strength of the drop. The Arthashastra's passages on espionage and war speak to Chanakya's belief that the ends justify the means. This belief is nuanced, however. For example, Chanakya allows kings to use any means necessary to win a war: assassination, trickery, propaganda, and more. However, he recommends fighting in an honorable manner when one has greater strength than the enemy. When equal or weaker to the enemy, he encourages trickery. When the war is won, Chanakya requests that kings treat the conquered humanely. But perhaps the aspect of the Arthashastra that is most often cited in recent times is that of foreign policy. Today, Chanakya's views of competitive states as a sort of mandala, and his unemotional explanation as to what states make natural enemies and what states make natural allies, are taught in policy schools throughout the world. Chanakya died in 283 BCE, having guided both Chandragupta Maurya and Bindusara. His legacy is truly impressive. For thousands of years, his vision of governance influenced kings and kingmakers in both South Asia and Southeast Asia. Today, his teachings have even found purchase in business and policy schools in the Western world. Chanakya was a man ahead of his time, greater and more innovative than Machiavelli, to whom he is often compared. And now you know.
India and Southeast Asia have a rich, overlapping history. In art, architecture, language, and religion, India and Southeast Asia share striking similarities. But how and when did Southeast Asia become so Indianized? The answer is hidden in an ancient Cambodian love story. Cambodia's origins are anything but ordinary. The love between a native princess and an Indian merchant served as its foundation. Yup, Cambodia's first king was an Indian merchant, a man known as Kondinya. Kondinya's story begins in the 1st century CE. His historical name, Kondinya, provides the first insight into his life, because it's not his true given name. Kondinya is a reference to a Brahmin community that populates the Andhra Orissa coast, a region commonly known as Kalinga. Kalinga was a powerhouse of early Indian trade, and their merchant mariners were called Sadhava. Kondinya himself was a Brahmin Sadhava, and it's likely that he was wealthy and well-connected. He was the owner of one or more large merchant vessels, or boidas, the expertly crafted, square-sailed ships of Kalinga. There was at least one major manufacturing center for boidas at Golabai, on Lake Chilika. Lake Chilika also served as a port of departure for merchants. As a large body of water with a narrow opening to the sea, it offered a natural, protected harbor. But before we turn our focus back to Kondinya, let's take a look at the bigger picture. In this era, foreign trade was so extensive that port cities like Nagapatnam had bazaars crowded with crates of imported goods. This trade is associated with a long period of rising prosperity in both South and Southeast Asia. But trade wasn't limited to the east. In the west, Rome had just conquered Egypt, and thanks to the revitalization of old Egyptian maritime routes, Romans and Indians began trading extensively. Roman senators were hyper-concerned about hyper-deflation, as so much of their silver was being depleted by being sent to India through trade. So with all that in mind, let's get back to Kondinya. Kondinya set sail for Southeast Asia in the 1st century CE, but how did he actually get there? In that era, Indian mariners would wait for seasonal monsoon winds coming from the northeast. Using these winds, they quickly sailed down the coast, all the way to Sri Lanka. Along the way, mariners would conduct trade at urban centers on the coast. Then, from the northern tip of Sri Lanka, Indian mariners would cut a straight path to Southeast Asia, across the Bay of Bengal. Severe weather and rampant piracy made this crossing extremely dangerous. But dangers notwithstanding, they would arrive in Southeast Asia at the mouth of the Andaman Sea. From here, Indian mariners could continue into the Straits of Malacca, hug the southern coast of Sumatra all the way to Java, make a brief land crossing at the Isthmus of Kra. We don't know which specific route Kondinya took, but we do know that he eventually found himself in the Gulf of Thailand, ready to do business. Kondinya could have been carrying a variety of high-demand Indian goods: cotton textiles, jewelry, and metalware. In addition, he could have been carrying Western goods. all of this valuable cargo put a target on Kondinia's back. Pirates would almost certainly be lurking on the fringes. And wouldn't you know it, they were. Kondinia's ship was surprise attacked by local pirates. He and his crew fought bravely and successfully repulsed the pirates, but the ship was damaged during the attack. Kondinia was forced to beach the ship for repairs. While beached, Kondinia and his crew must have feared a second attack, but they needn't have worried, for the pirates had been employed by a local chieftain, whose daughter, Soma, had fallen in love with the handsome young merchant. It was Kondinia's bravery during the attack that won her affections. Soma sent over a marriage proposal. Kondinia must have been surprised, or perhaps he feared for his life should he reject it. In the end, he accepted the proposal. This is considered a landmark event in Cambodian history, the establishment of its first true kingdom, with an Indian merchant sitting on its throne. But Kondinia and Soma's marriage was not the last of its kind. It would serve as a blueprint for many Indian Southeast Asian political marriages to come. We're interested in the capital T truth. So why did Soma actually marry Kondinia? And why were Indian Southeast Asian political marriages so common? In the late classical era, Southeast Asia was characterized by fragile, politically fractured states. But change was on the horizon. With rising trade came an influx of wealth, and new agricultural developments led to a population. Political and cultural traditions had already solved these societal challenges. India was already densely populated, wealthy, and urbanized. For hundreds of years, in fact. Simply put, Indianization was a solution to the problems that Southeast Asia now faced. And who better to implement Indianization than Indians themselves? Educated Indians were imported in droves. For example, Brahmin clerks were brought from India to serve in Southeast Asian administrations. And most of these Indian immigrants married local women, often noble women. Access to nobility gave Indian immigrants institutional legitimacy. In other words, they were given power and the means to wield it. Chinese historical records are illuminating in this regard. These records make reference to several Indian immigrants who became royals in Cambodia. Reports include one king of Funan, Chandana, yes, another immigrant from India, who sent a gift of elephants to Jin Dynasty China. Another one of these reports include an Indian Brahmin whose name also translates to Kondinia. This Kondinia II supposedly heard a voice telling him that he was a rightful ruler of Funan, and so he journeyed to the east. When he arrived in Funan, reports indicate that he was welcomed warmly and was selected as their new king, presumably by marrying a local princess. The Chinese report even points out, Kondinia changed all the laws to conform to the system of India. Active yet peaceful social transformation is rare, and it's even more rare for foreigners to lead the transformation. That's why the Indianization of Southeast Asia is such a surprising historical moment. To summarize, foreign immigrants were brought in to fill the ranks of elite society. These new immigrants were actually encouraged to shape the local culture so that it more closely resembled their own. And all of this happened without threats, violence, or other pressure. But Indianization wasn't a one-time event. It was a continuous process occurring over a 1,000-year period. The story of Kondinia and Soma is just one of many in this larger saga. So returning to our original question, why did Soma choose Kondinia? The answer should be obvious now. Kondinia was exactly what she needed to succeed in an increasingly Indianized world. As a Southeast Asian noblewoman, Soma could offer institutional legitimacy. Kondinia, on the other hand, was a wealthy and well-connected merchant, presumably by marrying a local princess. The Chinese report even points out, Kondinia changed all the laws to conform to the system of India. Active yet peaceful social transformation is rare, and it's even more rare for foreigners to lead the transformation. That's why the Indianization of Southeast Asia is such a surprising historical moment. To summarize, foreign immigrants were brought in to fill the ranks of elite society. These new immigrants were actually encouraged to shape the local culture so that it more closely resembled their own. And all of this happened without threats, violence, or other pressure. But Indianization wasn't a one-time event. It was a continuous process occurring over a 1,000-year period. The story of Kondinia and Soma is just one of many in this larger saga. So returning to our original question, why did Soma choose Kondinia?
The answer should be obvious now. Kondinya was exactly what she needed to succeed in an increasingly Indianized world. As a Southeast Asian noblewoman, Soma could offer institutional legitimacy. Kondinya, on the other hand, was a wealthy and well-connected merchant with extensive political and commercial networks in India. Kondinya's Indianness was an advantage with real-world, measurable consequences. It's worth noting, Soma's family was not that powerful. They controlled only a small sub-region of Khmer territory, but Kondinya's arrival changed their fortunes. Together, Kondinya and Soma expanded this humble state into a large and prosperous kingdom. Perhaps this rapid expansion was made possible by Kondinya's Indianness. He had the tools to fast-track the process of Indianization, after all. Between the 4th and 8th centuries CE, several prosperous empires emerged in India and Southeast Asia. Each of these entities were heavily engaged in the Indianization process, the Guptas and the Pallavas exporting their culture, and Srivijaya importing it. But this wasn't entirely a one-way exchange. Southeast Asia had at least some impact on the subcontinent too. Consider the Pallava dynasty. The Pallavas were a wealthy and powerful trading empire whose origins have been the subject of a spirited debate. Early historians suggested Persian roots, while later historians suggested Tamil or Telugu roots. These historians had an incomplete view, however. Recent scholarship has revealed a hybrid South Indian and Southeast Asian origin. See, the Pallava dynasty began with the South Indian king's marriage to a queen who was referred to as a Naga. The Naga queen may have actually been Southeast Asian. Consider the term Naga itself. The term Naga, which denotes a race of mythical snake humans, has long been associated with the people of Southeast Asia. In Cambodia, for example, Khmer royalty made Naga iconography essential to their identity, and Naga carvings litter their temples and palaces. Perhaps this connection shouldn't be too surprising, given what we know about the Pallava dynasty. The Pallavas had a long history of inserting themselves into international affairs in the rest of Asia. For example, in the early 700s, they entered into a mutual defense pact with Tang Dynasty China. But let's explore another story from the dynasty's past. In 731 CE, the Pallavas were on the brink of collapse. Their king, Parameshvara, suddenly died in battle, leaving no direct heir. There was a danger that rival kingdoms would encroach on their territory. The Pallavas had to find the proper king to take the throne, and they had to do it quickly. A formal delegation was created to find Hiranya, the descendant of an ancient Pallava prince named Bhima. Bhima was an ancestor of the now-deceased king, so his descendants, Hiranya and others, would have a right to take the throne. But there was a catch. Hiranya was not to be found in India, for Bhima had traveled abroad, married a Southeast Asian princess, and had become the ruler of a foreign kingdom through that marriage. Now I'd say that's a familiar story, don't you think? So with all this in mind, the Pallava delegation boarded a ship to Southeast Asia to speak to Bhima's descendant, King Hiranyavarman. It's believed that he was the leader of the Champa kingdom, located in modern-day Vietnam. When they arrived at Hiranya's court, the delegation was warmly received, and soon enough, the delegation got down to business. They asked for one of Hiranya's sons to come back to India and take the Pallava throne. Hiranya's youngest son agreed to this mission. At just 12 years old, he made the journey to South India. He was given the regnal name Nandivarman II and ascended the Pallava throne. Rival claimants and power-hungry nobles felt this was a wrong decision. After all, Nandivarman II was a foreigner. To quell this concern, Nandivarma II and his supporters made efforts to highlight his true Pallava heritage. But here's some food for thought. What made his background true is that he was of mixed Indian and Southeast Asian ancestry, just like the original pairing that founded the Pallava dynasty. Nandivarman II would grow to become an extremely successful king. He was perhaps the greatest of the Pallavas, presiding over an empire at its apex, an economic and cultural golden age. And all this he accomplished as a foreigner. Nandivarman's foreign origins seem to have ensured his continued interest in Eastern affairs. For example, inscriptions written on his behalf have been found in northern Malaysia, in the kingdom of Kedah. Interestingly, this kingdom is located in the Bujang Valley, which roughly translates to Valley of the Serpents. And in Sanskrit, the term Bujang is a synonym of the term Naga. Very curious indeed. Nandivarman II is, like Kondinya and other pioneers before him, a symbol of Indianization and the deep connection between India and Southeast Asia. Only today, after 6 centuries of Chinese, Arab, and European influence, has the contribution of India been neglected. And now you know. Welcome to the year 1070 CE. In South India, the legendary Chola Empire teeters on the brink of collapse. The emperor is dead, and the conflict over royal succession could spiral into an all-out war. In the Deccan, the ambitious Vikramaditya seeks to place a puppet king on the now vulnerable Chola throne, part of his larger plan to conquer all of India. Vikramaditya might have gotten away with it too, if it wasn't for a meddling prince known as Kulotunga. Kulotunga was no ordinary man. He was a decisive commander who took brilliant, calculated risks, and in an era of change and uncertainty, he saved the Chola Empire and rebuilt it as a nimble superpower. This is the story of an empire reforged in the fires of conflict. By the mid-11th century, the Chola Empire had transformed itself from a small local kingdom into a large multi-ethnic powerhouse. How? First, the Cholas swallowed up their previous masters when they were at their most vulnerable. Then came the 1-2 punch of Rajaraja and Rajendra Chola. In just a short time, they submitted the remainder of Tamil country, the southern Deccan, Andhra, Kerala, and Sri Lanka. They also defeated the forces of Orissa and Bengal and set up a forward base on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Having subdued all their maritime rivals in India, the Cholas were free to launch a